and we will get back to it. So can everybody see the start screen again? Everyone can see the Oxford tutorial webinar page. Okay, fantastic, we're good to go. So good morning, everybody, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. It's so great to see you all. So great to see some familiar faces and some new faces here today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Roseanne Chantiluke. I'm the Executive Director for the Centre for Tutorial Teaching, also known as CTT, and we're based in Oxford in the UK. And what we are, we're a global centre of excellence for tutorial teaching and learning. And what we do is we deconstruct the tutorial method as a pedagogy through training, consultancy, coaching, and research for schools, universities, companies, and corporations across the globe. If you'd like to learn more about us, we'll post our contact information at the end of the webinar, but if you cannot wait until then, feel free to quickly take a look at www.centrefortutorialteaching.org. That's centre spelt with a TRE for our American friends in the room today. So today marks the start of the CTT webinar series. So the point of the series is to showcase different insights around tutorial learning from staff, partners, and friends of CTT across the globe. I'm really excited to introduce you to today's speaker. Some of you already know him, Mr. David Palfreyman, who'll be speaking to us about the historical debates underpinning liberal, higher and vocational education and where the tutorial method sits in that debate. So I'm just going to give you a bit more information about Mr. Palfreyman. So David Palfreyman is the Fellow of New College, University of Oxford. New College is one of the constituent colleges of the University of Oxford, and he's also the Director of the Oxford Centre for Higher Education Policy Studies, also known as OxCHEPS. He's also a member of the Board of the Office for Students, which is the regulatory body that oversees English universities over here. His book, The Oxford Tutorial, has been translated into Chinese and into Korean, and his other recent publications include Universities and Colleges, a very short introduction, and The Law of Higher Education. So David and I have talked about how we want this session to go. We want it to be interactive, discursive webinar, so feel free to add in the chat as you have been as we go. There'll be a dedicated slot for questions at the end of the presentation, but feel free to jump in and ask questions or react and submit any comments that come to mind as David speaks. So without further ado, I'll hand over to David and I'll be moderating the chat as we go.
Thank you very much, Roseanne, and welcome everybody, and thank you very much for attending this this webinar. I'm not capable of following the chat and talking at the same time, so I'll rely on our compere to alert me if the chat's saying, I don't understand what he's saying, or will he speak louder, or whatever. Okay, this is not a sales pitch for CTT. That may come later. It's an exploration of just what is education and what it means to educate and to be educated. I hope, therefore, it's of interest as a philosophical, historical review and something that helps you think about what you may be doing if you're currently an educator or if you're being educated. So that's what it's about, and I'm going to work my way through a number of slides as we go. Okay, so I think we've got slide 3, and exactly as it says there, the Oxford Tutorial is a pedagogical concept designed to enhance the teaching and learning of undergraduates and first degree students here in Oxford, but we believe it can be extended generally to higher education, although we accept that many universities will not have the funding resources that we possess here in Oxford, but we still believe that with some tweaking, it can be a valuable pedagogical tool used in university teaching. Its close cousin is something called the supervision in Cambridge. They're very different in Cambridge. They always have a different name for the same thing. And basically, it's 2 students, 2 tutees, and 1 academic, the tutor, or in Oxford terms, the Don, the Oxford Don in Oxford speak, and they're in this tutorial for 1 hour, the tute, as sometimes students refer to it. And students will basically have 3 tutorials a fortnight, 12 a term in our 8-week term here at Oxford, over their 3 or 4 year degree course. And in the humanities, the tutorials will be very central to the whole teaching mechanism. In the sciences, they are a supplementation to the lectures and, of course, the laboratory practicals that you get in the sciences. Whatever it is, it's not meant to become a mini tutorial where the one academic just lectures in mini style to the two students. That way, at least the students go to sleep and probably the academic goes to sleep as well. It's meant to be interactive and it's meant to bring students in to what we might call the academic discourse. Okay, next slide, please. I'll skip him. There we go. Now, all this stems from about 20 years ago, as Oxford was quite rightly broadening its diversity of intake, and where you could no longer assume and no longer should assume that our new students had an uncle or an auntie or a father or mother who'd been to Oxford and knew all about the tutorial and what would happen to the students. I decided it was time we wrote up a little book about what we do and why we're doing it, and updated our presentation of this, what in effect is our USP, our unique business proposition in terms of what Oxford is about. So I produced this book in an early edition. This is the 2010 edition. There's a paperback edition from Amazon and Kindle, called the Oxford Tutorial, and it ended up with a Chinese translation from Peking University Press, and then ended up also in a Korean translation. And how and why did I come to write it, as I say, because I thought it was time to explain what we were doing, especially for whole new generations of students who did not necessarily, for family background, know all about what they were going to be encountering. So I got various of my academic colleagues to write a short essay each about what they think they're doing when they spend an hour in a tutorial in economics or engineering or physics or mathematics or history or English literature or foreign languages or politics, whatever, trying to cover most of the big subjects. And they all rose to the occasion, produced their little essays, and I added a kind of generalized introduction about the concept of liberal education. And that first volume appeared in 2008. We expanded it a bit in 2000, expanded it a bit in 2008, and it's become more accessible as a Kindle and easy acquired paperback through Amazon in 2019. And through CTT, we've been trying to explore whether there's anything in the Oxford Tutorial as a pedagogical concept that could be usefully translated not only to other universities as part of their teaching delivery, but indeed also utilised in the school years prior to access to tertiary education of some kind. Now, the next slide, please. So there's a bit again about the tutorial. As far as I know, no other major university outside of Cambridge and Oxford uses it to the same degree as such an integral part of teaching delivery. And of course, as I've said, Oxbridge can only afford to do it because of our private charitable endowment, which allows us to subsidise the whole teaching package. And other universities don't have the privilege of that kind of assets behind them, or in some cases they may have the assets, but they don't choose to deploy it into quite such an intensive delivery of teaching. I think the nearest probably is, apart from Cambridge, is as I say there, Princeton, where something called the Precept is arguably a remote cousin of the tutorial in Oxford and the supervision in Cambridge. All of that, by the way, is discussed to some extent in this neat little book, which is the only book I've ever written with pictures in it, and it's been the most difficult book to write, even though it's very small, simply because you had to write something that was intelligible to normal people, as opposed to academics only writing for other academics, and also try and write it in such a way that it might be interesting, which is normally not a requirement in academic life. So this little very short introduction to university and colleges, complete with pictures, is kind of fitting the tutorial into this great big global activity called the delivery of higher education, and all the aspects and dimensions and problems and challenges which it faces. I skipped a book, but by the way, this was the last thing written on the tutorial before the 2000 book. This is Will G. Moore, who was a fellow of St. John's College, and in the mid-60s, he wrote about the tutorial system and its future. And that was the last time before 2000 that Oxford had thought about or written about this major feature of the Oxford teaching experience. Okay, next slide, please. So there again, as I say, we're a little bit of an advert CTT. It's trying to work with other universities. It's trying to work with primary and secondary schools. It's thinking about how the tutorial concept can be introduced into teacher training and staff development in schools, so that those folk can in turn introduce it to their students, and also as a dimension in out there in the real world, the world of commerce and business, how it fits into staff training and development in the workplace. And now, maybe that's an old-fashioned term and I'm out of date, but I always think of staff training. Training is maybe where you're trying to produce a cadre of people, and they're going to be into the management grade or the supervisor grade, and you train them how to apply the health and safety policy, how to deal with the overtime scheduling, and so on and so forth. That's training, it's instruction, it's concrete knowledge to help them do their job in the business. But I think of staff development, where development is about whether you're growing your staff, to use a trendy term, if that's still trendy, growing your staff, developing them, helping them to think more about their business, and maybe hopefully contribute to the business and their own job satisfaction and the job satisfaction of their team by being more open and flexible while still clearly applying the health and safety policies and so on. So we're trying to think whether or not this pedagogical concept has some value when translated not just beyond other universities and schools, but also into the workplace. Okay, next slide, please. So the key concept, as I've touched upon slightly with the tutorial, with the TOT, is the engagement of students in academic discourse, what we do as academics in universities, that we hope engenders their ability to think independently and critical, and often the phrase critical thinking is used by people who promote this style of education, so that they're able to articulate their opinions and assessments in a clear, coherent and cogent way, both in written form through the essays they produce, typically in the tutorials, but also in defending those essays in the engagement of conversation with their fellow student in the tutorial and with the academic who's leading the tutorial. And this, to some degree, is very different from other educational models that, partly for financial and resources reasons, tend to have the student receiving instruction. And some universities use the term instruction as if learning how to assemble flat pack furniture. And often, as I say, in some universities, the academic is labeled as an instructor, as might be, say, a gym trainer or a drill sergeant in the army. So the Oxford tutorial is identified with the delivery of a liberal education and critical thinking approach to just what is actually higher about this thing we call higher education. And maybe, the higher bit is this academic discourse, is this deeper critical thinking than you might find in post-1618 further education, in secondary education 11 to 1618, and in primary education 4/5 to 11. But as I've already stressed, we hope through CTT that we can demonstrate a role for the tutorial method so it's successfully to inform pedagogical practice across the whole education range and maybe outside of traditional education forums. I think that's slide 7 covered. I'll skip on to slide 8, if I may. And so often the contrast is drawn between academic and on the one hand, and vocational education on the other, in that in tertiary education, do you go to the university for the academic education, and you go to a community college or a further education college or a technical Hochschule or something for a vocational education to turn you into a mechanic or a hairdresser or a plumber or an electrician. And it's often seen as between liberal education and skills education, but we think that dichotomy is too stark. We think that the tutorial concept can be used in every form of higher education delivery across the age range, as I've said, and across the types of education activity, and its gentle use by the teacher academic of Socratic questioning. This is the root of it. You tease out the student's thinking through this gentle Socratic question. Now, what if, what then, why suggest that, etc., rather than, as it were, filling up the minds. Now, what needs to be stressed here is this is not liberal education in my definition, as say liberal education is sometimes said to be in American universities, where you often talk about liberal education as the concept of physics for poets, you make humanities students do a bit of hard science, or great books of literature for engineers, where you make the scientists have a look at books and prose. It's more than that. It's about being able to apply this liberal education pedagogy, this critical thinking pedagogy, to any and every subject. And that's why the little book on the tutorial has essays from my colleagues who teach physics or engineering, as well as the obvious areas where they're teaching English literature or history. Okay, next slide, please. So what I wanted to do was just to help you put this into a historical context. There's nothing new about what CTT is trying to do, or on that book that I wrote, that I produced on the tutorial. This has been around for centuries, if not millennia, as a debate about what is the purpose of education, what is the style of education that one should be trying to deliver. It's a perpetual question. There's no one answer. We're never going to produce the perfect balance of education delivery and say we've finished now as educators. That's it. It's all over. We know what we're doing. It's about how can education create individuals best able to better navigate life's challenges and life's changes in their job environment, in society, or whatever, by being able to continue learning. And that, of course, is a phrase of continuous learning, adult learning, and so on, so that they can confidently and rigorously review and evaluate new information and ideas as they crop up before them in their working lives, or indeed in their civic lives. Next slide, please. So just to begin, going back as far as I can track it, you had Socrates, and then you had Plato. We're back in ancient Greece. We're about, I think, 2500 BC or thereabouts, rather a long time ago. And there you have this quote from Plato. What's happening in these Socratic schools, a kind of precursor of the modern idea of the university. And the quote is, after long study and discussion, under the guidance of an experienced teacher, a spark may suddenly leap, as it were, from mind to mind, and the light of understanding so kindled will then feed upon itself. So it's more than just instruction. I'm giving you knowledge, I'm giving you information, go away or come back and regurgitate it in an exam. It's about, let's discuss what you're now learning until you reach the point where the student can contribute intelligently to that academic discourse. That spark happens, the teacher, the educator has achieved what they've set out to do, or is beginning to achieve it. Turn on to the next slide, please. And there we have Confucius, who, funnily enough, at about exactly the same time, 2500 BC, but as far as we know, they were not in sort of text contact or sending emails to each other. But there's an analogy with what was happening in terms of the concept of education in ancient China. And as many of you will be familiar with the Confucian Analects, this is a 1943 Oxford University Press edition, which is quite interesting. In the middle of World War II, Oxford University Press thought it should produce a new edition of Confucius the Analects, which shows how important this was, that philosophically people were still thinking about this important territory, even while England was due to be overrun by Hitler or whatever. So what Confucius said is learning without thinking is useless, that it's no good thinking education is just about handing over a lot of knowledge, filling up the young minds and sending them away. We've got to also teach them how to think. And it went on, he who learns but does not think is lost. And then Confucius, of course, this strong idea of the gentleman, a bit akin to the philosopher king that the Greeks thought should be in charge of Greek society and Greek politics. Confucius had the idea of the gentleman, a gentleman, but nowadays we would think of it as gender neutral. A gentleman can see a question from all sides without bias. A gentleman is open to thinking about what information they're being given. They don't just come at it from a prejudiced point of view, given that the nobler sort of man is broad-minded and not prejudiced. Next slide, please. And of course, much of that was picked up by Newman, the idea of a university, which is often set out as not just the idea, but the ideal of what should be happening. And of course, you play with that in the context, as we do in the little, very short introduction, with what the Humboldt definition of a university and the thinking about the German research universities, the American universities with the land-grant institutions, and somewhere like Johns Hopkins importing the German model, but also places like Harvard and Princeton and Yale and Dartmouth having the Newmanesque kind of model. And then more recently, you have the very famous model of the California master plan concept of what higher education is about. But Newman, again, picking up the idea of the gentleman, says, the person who's been properly educated has a real cultivation of mind, that education is not mere knowledge, not learning or acquirement, it's more than that, but rather is thought or reason exercised upon knowledge. So you've acquired your knowledge, you have your factual base. Now it's time to think about what it is you have in front of you or that you've absorbed. Thus, in The Gentleman honed by Newman's concept of a liberal education, a habit of mind is formed which lasts throughout life, of which the attributes are freedom, equitableness, calmness, moderation, and wisdom. So a gentleman is probably the last person who will fall foul of fake news and all the rest that the enthusiasms of social media and so on. Somebody who can stand back from that and assess what really is going on. So there we have Newman. Turn over again, and these are fairly at random picked as quotes. There's lots more that one could think of, but those of you who might be familiar, Flexner studied universities, American, English, German in the 1930s, and did great tours of those institutions and wrote about the kinds of education, what lay behind those universities in their philosophy of what they were doing. And so a quote, just one sentence from this quite long book, a liberal education should concern itself primarily with the liberation, organization, and direction of power and intelligence with the development of taste. Taste, of course, is a bit of a loaded term, but nonetheless, what he's trying to say is not dissimilar to Newman or indeed Confucius, that it's about a deeper understanding and using that to support careers and, as I say, wider contribution as a member of a civic society. Turning again, please. Whitehead, some of you may be familiar with, an American philosopher of education, 1932. Fools act on imagination without knowledge. Pedants act on knowledge without imagination. So an education that doesn't give you the knowledge platform foundations for doing your thinking just might mean that you're a fool randomly thinking, but without actually making much progress. But equally, an education that leaves you full of knowledge, but without any ability to apply it and think about it and adjust it and add to it, is leaving you functioning without imagination and as a pedant, probably peddling the knowledge that's 25 years out of date. Turn again, please. And Dominguez, and here, I think one of my best quotes that I'm most pleased with unearthing, very good quote: "A liberal education is what remains after you have forgotten the facts that were learned while becoming educated." So I did a history degree sometime in the last century, indeed in the last millennia, here at Oxford in the 1970s. I think I'd be hard pressed to remember very much of my dates and my facts. I can remember 1066, that's about the only date, and some sort of civil war happened in the 1640s. But what the point is that factual stuff that was used at the time, but nonetheless what I remain is my sense of history, I hope, and my interpretation of life through that liberal education, which was gained by taking a degree in history, but the same could be if I'd done English literature, or arguably, we say in CTT, even if I'd done physics or engineering, I can still have a liberal education approach to it. Next slide, please. Then one always has to revert to the Oxford English Dictionary, of course, given that where I'm sitting and the money Oxford makes from selling those dictionaries. A liberal education is directed to a general intellectual enlargement and refinement, not narrowly restricted to the requirements of technical or professional training. And that's very much the line that Newman was taking. We turn over again. I'm going to go deeper back. I've been in the ancient Rome and ancient Greece. I've given you 19th century stuff and on into the 20th century. But I'll now give you William Baldwin and Thomas Palfreyman. I don't know whether that's a relative or not. If it is, it's the only famous relative I've got, or ancestor. 1575, a treatise on moral philosophy. And there's a chapter of learning and knowledge. Again, I'm stressing that this sort of stuff has been talked about for centuries. Nobody has a perfect answer, but it's something we still wrestle with and should still wrestle with in terms of what we think it is to educate young people in the 21st century. Now, Baldwin and Palfreyman cite inter alia Socrates, that I've already mentioned, as seeing himself in his teaching style, that Socratic questioning that I mentioned, as a midwife, quote, in terms of bringing out or bringing forth wisdom through education itself as a process of drawing out or expanding the mind, as opposed to mere instruction that just fills up the mind. And later on, I'll give you a quote from Dickens that illustrates that style of education rather perfectly. Baldwin and Palfreyman also quote Seneca, "Search for the cause of everything." And note, we have Confucius saying, "The master said, if a man does not ask himself, what am I to make of this? What am I to make of that? There is nothing whatever I can make of him." In other words, again, there's a linkage there in thinking. Seneca is further cited, "An opinion without learning cannot be good." And Plato is mentioned as a captain, as a director of the whole boat. So reason joined with knowledge is the guide to life. this idea that you need your instruction. Yes, you need your rote learning, your rote memorization, although with Google these days, maybe you need less of that and more of the analytical and critical thinking skills. Turn over again, please. And then we move on a century. We have Obadiah Walker of education, writing in the late 17th century, thinking about what should be happening in this, the rudimentary schools that we found in England at that time, and what it is that you're trying to produce in education, which is partly good judgment. Good judgment arises from a sound education such that the person is enabled, quote, thereby to discern and choose true from false, good from bad, good from lesser, proper knowledge and understanding from fake information in our 21st century language, and to discourse pertinently and rationally in a way that brings a question to the point and discovers the very center and knot of difficulty, warns and activates the spirit in the activates the spirit in the search of truth, excise notions, and by that means develops ideas, play with interesting ideas, think about things, be imaginative, be creative, but be critical in your thinking about such matters. Thus, sound learning is not about memory, as he puts it, what we might think of as rote learning, even more so in the age of Google, as I said, but about the ability to digest what is read and to know where a difficulty lies and how to solve it, to discourse, to doubt, to argue upon and against, and as I say, throughout life, to rise to the challenge of change around you in your careers, in your civic society, or whatever, and contribute through the use of that critical thinking. Final quote, just in case I'm really boring you, sorry, is George Turnbull, 1742, so we've moved on a few decades, Observations upon Liberal Education. And Turnbull argued for reform of schools. By no means was there universal schooling, of course, in the country at that time, but for what schools existed, a reform for changing in the teaching style and for a much broader curriculum, and in essence for a liberal education that ensures youth are duly, quote, warned and armed against the vices and snares with which they will find the world to abound as soon as they enter it. I'm not sure much has changed since then. He praises the Socratic method of teaching, whereby the young are encouraged, quote, in finding out truths for themselves, where the teachers, quote, take frequent opportunities of instructing their pupils by conversation, by leading them to ask questions, by acting as the midwife of their thoughts. And there again, he's picking up that Socrates concept from nearly 2,000 years before. Such teachers must not trust entirely to their grave and formal lectures. Such pupils are encouraged to speak out what they have learned, not by rote, but easily in their own words, from their judgments and not from memories. Turnbull means judgments as what we now think of as critical thinking, and memories as what we consider to be rote learning. Thus, liberal education, this liberal education process produces, quote, the habit of comparing and computing, patience of thinking, virtue of strength of mind, and it leaves the educated, quote, better, quote, able to resist all the most inviting specious promises and solicitations of objects till their pretensions have been thoroughly tried and canvassed. Final quote is Dickens, and I can't resist this one because I remember being an 11-year-old at grammar school and having to declaim this at a declamation competition. So some of you may be familiar with Charles Dickens, the great author of Victorian society and all its terrible things going on in Victorian society, the mill owners, the grinding poverty, the pollution, etc., Manchester, London, in the Industrial Revolution. But what Dickens then writes of Mr. Gradgrind, wonderful name, Mr. Gradgrind, who's a mill owner in Coketown, which is actually a fictional place representing the grim northern industrial towns of Manchester and Preston and so on. And Mr. Gradgrind has a school for his child workers. They'd be working in the factory from the age of 5 or 6 or 7, the mill owner in the mill, but he very generously, as a progressive mill owner, at least he'd actually invented a school for them to go to, probably on a Saturday afternoon or a Sunday with what little time they ever got off. But his school, as far as he's concerned, has a rather clear educational philosophy as he expounds to a new teacher at the beginning of the book, chapter 1, called The One Thing Needful. And Mr. Gradgrind declaims in front of the class to the teacher, "Now, what I want is facts. Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are what I wanted in life. Plant nothing else and root out everything else. In this life, we want nothing but facts." So these young children, their life is destined to work in the mill. You don't want them thinking, you don't want them developing their minds too much. You simply want to fill them with whatever facts you think are pertinent to their future lives. And all of this is conducted, the scene is, quote, a plain, bare, monotonous vault of a schoolroom, with Mr. Gradgrind's voice inflexible, dry and dictatorial, and the speaker possessing an obstinate carriage, square coat, square legs, square shoulders, the very personification of capitalism in Victorian England. And the sea of watching pupils are the inclined plane of little vessels, then and there arranged in order, ready to have imperial gallons of facts poured into them until they were full to the brim. And is that education as we see it? We filled the minds with facts, out they go into the big wide world, or do we want to begin to develop those minds to make use of those facts, to think about them, to have that critical thinking element of education? So next slide, please. So what I invite you to do, if you do anything after this webinar, is to ask yourself whether your personal experience of education, be it at primary school, at secondary school, possibly at the tertiary education stage, has been essentially rote learning instruction, or has included aspects of a more liberal education, and how it perhaps been a well-balanced mix of both, so that you're very satisfied with what has happened to you in the process of your education so far. Ask yourself, what kind of education? Do you want Mr. Gradgrind's application of facts or Newman's usage of thought? What kind of education do you personally need routinely in best carrying out your job and looking for promotion in your career and development in your career and working life? Ask yourself, what kind of education did you or do you now most enjoy? The Confucius concept of mere learning as Newman's label of just acquirement, or Plato's idea of a spark to kindle your interest and commitment. Ask yourself if your current work is fulfilling your current career. If it is, I'm pleased for you, everybody deserves that. If it is it because you can utilize the Socrates concept of reason joined with knowledge and feel that you are really developing yourself and your job and assisting your employer and business or whatever? Or is it because it simply gives you scope to display your knowledge of facts? And actually you enjoy saying, I know this, I know that, I know the other, but you don't know whether that will still carry you through a decade from now. Next bullet point, has your education mode made you a nobler sort of man or woman, Confucius style, and a gentleman, gentle person in Newman terms? Ask yourself finally, can it be said of your education that it warms and activates your spirit, the spirit walker, and has left you warned and armed against the vices and snares able to resist all the most inviting specious promises and solicitations. Turnbull. Next slide, please. I'm getting near the end, don't worry. So CTT that we've set up here in Oxford, we hope recognises that there can't be the higher level of liberal education and critical thinking, intellectual development, without, we acknowledge, first there having been some element of rote learning of core shared factual information on which academic discourse can later be built. So we're not in any way pretending you can do away with a whole side of education and just focus on this stuff. What we say is you need a balance of the two, but to be properly educated will involve a hard slog of acquiring that common foundation of knowledge, and then possibly an even harder slog of thinking hard about what it is you've acquired. So to conclude, next slide, I just want to end by linking a bit. We go back to Confucius, 2500 BC, and the Analects as quoted above, and we link that with Seneca and Plato as cited in Baldwin and Palfreyman. So we have, he who learns but does not think is lost, but at the same time, an opinion without learning cannot be good. Hence, as a captain, and there somebody's come up with that wonderful little image there of the captain's hat on the yacht. As a captain is a director of an whole boat, so reason joined with knowledge is a guide to life, and we would argue is the culmination of successful education and the proper fulfillment of our roles as educators. Thank you very much. I hope I'm not used up too much time and that there's time for, there you are, any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, particularly for our friends who are joining early in the morning. I bet you didn't expect to be taken through a journey centuries, thousands of years into the past to the present day. Those questions, particularly at the end, I found really striking. I very rarely think about my historical education in that way and how it's made me who I am and where I am in my role. So I hope that there's some useful food for thought there in terms of the journey and those end questions. Thank you so much, David, for that historical perspective on the debate. Have a think around some of the questions you might want to ask. We've got around 15 minutes for questions, but before you pop your questions in the chat, I just want to hand over to Mallory for a quick moment because I know she wanted to mention something here today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rose. And hi, everyone at Reach and Craft who know me. I think our Calling Academy friends from South Africa are here as well. It's good to see you all. I wanted to just take 30 seconds to give some framing that is particular to the Reach group, but my hope is that it will be useful for everyone, which is why Reach is here today, right? So to back up and give some context, I first met the Oxford group when I did my doctorates in education at Oxford. The unfortunate soul, Ken Mayhew, who you see on the thread here, was my original mentor tutor. And I was really struck by two things. One, it's my first time getting exposed to this tutorial-based method, and it was so much more important than any way in which I'd been taught in the past. It pushed me forward so much more. And then two, after that, I went back and became a classroom teacher, and I was serving a group of students who were low income, students of color. And the thing that I kept hearing over and over again was that everything I had just experienced as the tutorial would not be good teaching for those students, right? And those students being sent with a very loaded understanding of for whom this type of method makes sense. And the reason I mention that is, as David showed up on the screen, this is the tutorial method, or more broadly called deeper learning, inquiry-based learning, co-generative learning. It has names in many different settings that all are talking about the same principles. It's not a new concept. And for what was Oxford Teachers Academy, now part of Reach University as a whole, the bigger question was, how do you democratize access to it, right? Like first, how do you push back on the assumption that it is only for certain types of learners? And then second of all, even if and as we get to a point where we believe that everyone should get it, how do we operationalize that from a financial perspective, from a training and development perspective? How do you actually make that happen? And so that's how CTT came into be about 4 or 5 years ago. They started in their work at Oxford Day Academy, a charter school in the Bay Area that I helped co-found. And the results that they got in terms of the learning outcomes for students, getting criticized the whole way of like, how can you have students who are years below grade level who you're not doing remedial math, you're not doing remedial English. And Oxford Day Academy, having had its first graduating class last June, outperforming most schools in the state without any indicators of low income, first generation, serving populations that are historically excluded. And so the reason I say all of that today is like, I believe that everyone is on this thread because they already believe that all students can learn, and that they believe in deeper learning and inquiry as being a tool that if it's good enough for the people who are in elite privileged positions, it is good enough for every student, and every student deserves that access. And we know it's really hard to make that shift institutionally. And so the idea is not only how do we lean on groups like CTT for support with training, coaching, best practices, but also how do we build a network with groups like Calling Academy in South Africa, other CTT partnerships with schools in Mongolia, in Colombia, in New Zealand, and all of these other places around the world that are interested in this, so that the training and the reinforcement is not just our coaching, but our ability to build a network with like-minded peers and colleagues committed to doing this work all around the globe. So that's why Reach is here today. I am so thrilled for us to be able to lean on Rose's team with David and Ken and everybody else to be able to draw on those best practices. And we're just really grateful to be here. So just wanted to step back and make sure it's clear to everyone at Reach why we're here and what we're excited to do, and to be excited to be a part of this organization. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that framing, that context, and for that vision, Mallory. Before people submit their questions, either in the chat or raising their hand and speaking their questions, I have one to share with you, David, if that's all right. So I was particularly struck by the Newman quote, and particularly when he mentioned some of the attributes that a liberal education can foster, such as equitableness. And it had me thinking around this question of equity in education, which Mallory has just spoken to there. And I wondered, number one, what does equity in tertiary education mean to you? And number two, how might the tutorial method help our understanding of what equity in tertiary education looks like and what it can do?
Right. I mean, as some of you will know, it's a very hot political issue in British society at the moment, and a lot of change happening by way of trying to ensure that higher education, the access to it is widened. We often call it the access debate, and lying behind that are concepts of diversity and inclusiveness. And I always think of it in terms of, well, what do we mean? What is higher education? What is it we're trying to access anyway? And how is it different from other forms of education? What is higher about higher education, and how do you deliver higher education? And obviously, I'm a promulgator of the concept of the tutorial and so on, the academic discourse. But also it's about access for whom, to what, at what cost, and with what result. So I only think it works properly if it's clear that what's been provided is the opportunity to access high quality higher education, not overcrowded higher education, well-resourced higher education, where the teaching is along the lines we've been talking about, and where the contribution to the student's development is such that in return for whatever fees they may pay, or whatever debt they may incur, or whatever the taxpayer is paying on their behalf, there's something comes out of it, which is partly, one hopes, enhanced employability, because they can contribute what businesses think they want, and that of course assumes that businesses are on the same page in wanting people who've been properly educated, and also that they can contribute to their civic society. They're better citizens as a result. And I think, as Mallory so well put it, It's about believing that that sort of process should be provided for everybody and not just for an elite within our system. And of course, what that means in the UK context is a pressure on elite top universities that they broaden their access. And I was very heartened very recently to see as a kind of measure of that, maybe a simplistic measure, but it's a rather telling metric, that what we call an academy school, which in America I think are called charter schools, like Oxford Day Academy, that academy school in London has got more entrants through to Oxford and Cambridge than Eton has. Eton is the classic, mega well-funded independent school for posh families, boarding school that's produced generations of prime ministers for us, including the present one and the one before. So the idea that all of a sudden Oxford and Cambridge are looking for a wider diversity of intake, and at the same time there are schools that are producing perfectly credible candidates for admission, I think is very heartening, and that's a very little metric that indicates, I hope, that things are moving in the direction, in the right direction, and that all societies will have the same kind of issues about access to higher education, whether it's an issue of rural families as opposed to city families, whether it's a gender issue in some societies. In America, it's particularly got overtones of ethnicity. Here, it's largely a social economic sort of question, but with some element of ethnicity as well. So that's what I think I mean when I think about access and diversity and opening up higher education, but it has to be higher education that's worth accessing, and that we don't cheat those young people out of the arrangement by, yes, you've got in, but by the way, what you're getting is a bit of a pallid, watered down version compared with what we provide to some young people.
Thank you so much. I'll open up for questions from folks in the room. I think we've got time for about one or two. If there's anybody with a burning question to ask David around anything that he's discussed, his book, or anything else. Erin has raised her hand. Go ahead, Erin.
I don't have a question, but I just want to express my gratitude to David, to you, Rose, Mallory, of course, for putting this all together. As you know, a practitioner of higher education, whatever that may mean. I think it's wonderful to hear about how we can take historical approaches, look at what we're doing in current society and say, yes, this is important. Move beyond the industrialized, like Rose said, sort of mentality of let's put them, cram as many students as we can into a classroom and give them some facts. We can see that that probably hasn't done us real well as a society, at least at this point. So I'm excited to be a part. It was lovely to listen. I'll listen to a lecture with British accent all day long, but just gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Any other questions or comments?
I had one idea, David, if that's right. I was really interested in the way you described the way that the tutorial is both requires writing and a lot of and speaking as well. And it's interesting that this kind of orality of the tutorial, which seems both to be its connection, as it were, to some of the most ancient aspects of learning, but also the most sort of relevant transferable skill as well. I mean, I've never been asked to write an essay by my employer, but you have to sit there critiquing ideas and being comfortable with that sort of being orally critical. That struck me as really it's kind of interesting in the way that we focus often on transferable skills, and I think that maybe during the pandemic, one of the things that people realized, hence the medium that we're talking on, Zoom, is that need for that oral exchange to be part of education.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I mean, I think it's probably unlikely with most employers we'll be writing the sort of essays we wrote as undergraduates. but nonetheless, people get given projects to do, they get given the task of scoping something out, analysing what's already known about it and so on. So it's the same kind of skill set, the accessing of information, the marshalling of it, turning it into something that's pertinent and relevant, and expressing it and articulating it, sharing it with colleagues, and then thinking about what to do with it. So it's very much a skill set, I think, that a good liberal education can develop in whatever subject, and that is of use in most forms of working life or career progression. And yes, the point about I think in let's say the good old days, when once upon a time the staff student ratio in higher education in this country was 1 to 10, 1 to 12, and my colleagues who taught at universities in the 1960s would say, well, they had a seminar, but a seminar was 6, maybe 7 students gathered in the academic's office. It wasn't that much different from a tutorial of 2 here in Oxford or in Cambridge. Sadly, the pressure on numbers means that seminars have become 15, 20, 25, and the scope for discourse is much reduced unless you've got a really amazing seminar leader with great pedagogical skills who can make sure the whole room is engaged. And therefore, I would argue the scope for the academic discourse, the oral content, as you refer to it, has been markedly reduced in higher education in recent decades, with massification of higher education, which has got big pluses on one side, but runs the risk that it's a dilution of what we should be trying to do on the other side. And that's something that all national systems of higher education wrestle with in terms of the economics of higher education delivery.
Thanks.
I'm just looking at the time, and unfortunately it looks like we will have to wrap up now. I'm seeing a lot of action in the chat in terms of reflections on what's been discussed today. Ko said this is helpful, and she's thinking around how facts can be a basis, not the whole of one's education, and what can we take from that around the place of experience in higher education, life or work experience. So lots of food for thought. Thank you all so much for making it out here today, this afternoon, this evening, this morning, to listen to us. And this is our inaugural webinar. There'll be many in the future with different voices and different perspectives on where the tutorial method sits in education broadly. Today, if you want to keep in touch with us, there are many ways which you can do that. And I'll share some of our information here. Well, I think it's going to be very unlikely that any of you will be popping over to our brick and mortar office for a cup of tea and a chat anytime soon, unfortunately. But we do have the beauty of the internet. Our website is there, www.centrefortutorialteaching.org. And please feel free to send an email, give any feedback, any ideas for any themes that you would like to see discussed on this webinar series. Thank you so much for your time, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
And thank you for attending. And I can't guarantee that there'll always be a British accent, but do remember mine is a Northern Manchester accent, so very different from some you might encounter. But it's been a pleasure to give this talk and to have you attend.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.